So in the last video, we introduced the idea of a monopoly market. We defined a monopoly, as a market where there's one seller selling a unique product that has no close substitutes. There are high barriers to entry. It's hard for anyone new to come into the market, and therefore the monopolist has some control over price. So now let's talk about that price control and talk about some of the decisions that a monopolist is able to make. So a perfectly competitive firm is a price taker. They can't affect the price. No matter how much they produce, the price is just given to them by the market because there are so many competitors. They can't raise or lower the market price on their own. A monopolist, however, can affect the price of their product in a sense. So they don't really get to choose the price, because just like we saw in perfectly competitive markets, the people who choose the price of a product are always the demanders. The firm can try to set a particular price, but if your customers aren't willing to pay that price, then you lose, right? So the customers really are the ones who dictate what the price will be, and that's the demand curve. It tells us what people are willing to pay. But we'll see the monopolist has an ability to change the market price by changing their output level. So remember, there's the law of demand that says the more of something there is, the less people are willing to pay for it, right? So there's this inverse relationship between price and quantity. So and that is in what people are willing to pay for a product, right? So the monopolist can affect what people are willing to pay by changing the quantity, the level of output. So you increase quantities, you're going to be lowering the price. If you decrease quantities, you'll be increasing the price that people are willing to pay. And so in that sense, the monopolist is a price maker. They do have some control over what the market price is. So let's look at what the demand curve looks like for a firm in each of these types of markets. So yes, the demand curve is downward sloping for a market, right? So you've got the market demand curve that includes all demanders across all firms in a particular market. But then if you zero in on a single firm in a market, in a competitive market, for the competitive firm, the demand curve is flat. It's horizontal. Why is that? That's because, remember, demand is customers' willingness to pay. And if I'm a firm in a perfectly competitive market, the customer's willingness to pay is just whatever the market price is. And it doesn't matter how much I produce or how little I produce, the market price is the only price I can charge. If I try to go up on that price, I lose all my customers. And so while there is a downward sloping demand curve in the market, the demand curve that matters for me, just an individual firm in that market, is whatever the market price is. That's what people are willing to pay. And so for the firm in the competitive market, the demand curve is horizontal at whatever the market price is, right? For a monopolist, though, a monopolist is the only firm in the market. And so whatever the market demand curve looks like is what the firm's demand curve looks like, because there's not a bunch of firms, and there's no difference between the market demand and the firm's demand, because the firm is the market and the market is the firm. And so the downward sloping market demand curve is the demand curve that the monopolist has to operate by. So what this means is that as the monopolist increases quantities, they'll see the willingness to pay of their customers decrease. And as the monopolist decreases quantities, they'll see the willingness to pay increase. And so given that information, they have to now make decisions that will maximize profit for themselves, right? Any firm's goal is to maximize profit. It doesn't matter if you're a perfectly competitive market or a monopoly market or somewhere in between. Your goal is to make money, and not just to make some, but to make as much as possible. So profit maximizing. And the rule for maximizing profit is always that you will choose your level of output where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. It doesn't matter what market you're in. This is always the profit maximizing rule. Because remember our discussion here, the reason that this is how you maximize profit is that if any time marginal revenue is higher than marginal cost, it means you can produce one more product and bring in more money than it costs you to produce it. So you want to do it, right? That's a win for you. That's an increase in profit for you. But if marginal revenue then becomes lower than marginal cost, it means producing one more would cost you more than it brings you. And so you don't want to do that. So you'll continue to produce more and more and more and more until the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and then you'll stop because you don't want to continue into the area where marginal revenue is less than marginal cost. And this is maybe a good point to say, this is theoretical. Sometimes you don't get to a point where they're exactly equal, but you always definitely want to stop right before marginal revenue goes below marginal cost, right? So if you may have to stop where marginal revenue is slightly higher than marginal cost because going from maybe producing 10 to producing 11, at 10 marginal revenue is higher than marginal cost, and at 11 marginal revenue is lower than marginal cost, right? But you can't produce 10 and a half. So it depends on your market and what you're able to do, whether you actually can get to the equal mark. Theoretically, you want to get to the equal mark. In practice, you want to stop wherever you can, that's as close as you can to the equal mark, but before marginal revenue gets lower than marginal cost. So this is the profit maximizing rule, no matter who you are, whether you're a perfectly competitive firm or a monopoly firm or anywhere in between. You maximize profit by choosing your level of output where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Now, if you're a perfectly competitive firm, then the price that you charge for your product is equal to your marginal revenue, because that comes from the fact that you have this flat demand curve, that no matter how many you produce, the customer's only willing to pay that price, that set market price for it, which means if you produce 9 at $1 each, then you're making $9. If you produce one more, you go to produce 10, what is your marginal revenue? It's $1. It's whatever you charge for your product, right? So your marginal revenue, the amount of revenue you get from producing and selling one more of your product, is whatever that price is, because the price never changes. For a monopolist, that is not the case. Remember, Remember, the monopolist has this downward sloping demand curve. So if I'm here and I want to produce one more, it lowers my price. And it doesn't just lower my price for that last one that I sell, it lowers my price for all of them, because we're going to assume, in the next chapter we'll look at the option to charge different prices for different people, but here we're going to assume you're a monopolist who can only charge one price, right? So there's a sticker on what you sell, and everyone sees the same sticker. So every customer has to pay the same price, which means if you increase your output, you have to decrease your price for everybody, not just for that last person that you sell to. And so it turns out, because of this, that for a monopolist, the price is actually higher than your marginal revenue. Why? Because yes, when you sell one more, you bring in whatever the price is, right? But you're having to decrease your price for everybody that was buying before. And so you lose a little bit on them when you gain a new customer. And so your marginal revenue is less than what you actually get from the last thing that you sold. So let's look at an example. So this is you've got a demand schedule here where you see the quantity of customers in the far left column. Next is the price that they're willing to pay, right? And then the third column, we've calculated total revenue, which is price times quantity. And in the last column, we've calculated the marginal revenue per 1,000 customers. So the change in total revenue divided by the change in number of customers. But in this case, we're going to divide by the number in thousands. So, so notice that as you increase the number of customers here, you have to decrease the price for everyone. So in this row, the first row, the second row really, when you had 1,000 customers, you were able to charge each of them $90. And so you made $90,000. If you want to add another 1,000 customers, cool, but you're going to have to decrease your price to $80. which means, yeah, you're gaining $80 times those 1,000 customers that you didn't have before. So you're gaining that $80,000 because you increase your number of customers. But notice you're losing $10,000 off of each of these guys, right? So these folks were willing to pay you 90. Now you're only charging them 80. So at the same time that you gain 80 off of these guys, the new customers, you're losing 10 off of each of your old customers. And so your actual marginal revenue is only 70. It's not the full 80. It's not the full price that you're charging, right? It's the price you're charging, which is what you gain on your new customers, but then minus what you lost on your old customers, right? So your marginal revenue is the change in total revenue when you added more customers or when you changed your price, right? So it's the change from 90 to 160 divided by your 1,000 customers. So it's a $70,000 marginal cost. So notice that the marginal cost, the point here is your marginal revenue is always lower than whatever your price is. So here, your price is 70, your marginal revenue per 1,000 customers is only 50. Your price is 60, marginal revenue is 30. Price is 50, marginal revenue is 10. And the reason for this is that you have a downward sloping demand curve. Is that whenever you increase your price, or whenever you increase your quantity, you have to decrease your price. Otherwise, people won't buy what you're selling, right? So, so this is what we see. We see a marginal revenue that is always lower than price. And we see a total revenue, notice, that increases to some point and then starts decreasing again. Why is that? Remember, this goes back to our discussion of elasticity. So total revenue increases to some point, and then as you keep increasing your quantity and decreasing your price, your total revenue is going to start to fall. There's a sweet spot. There's a sweet spot of price and quantity where your revenue is maximized. And it's not just sell as many as you can. Because when you try to sell as many as you can, you have to decrease your price in order to sell them. And so why does total revenue increase and then decrease? It's because every time you change your quantity and your price, you have two things going on. You have a price effect where, yeah, all units are now sold at a lower price. So by itself, this is a loss for the firm. That's a bad thing, right? You're selling things at lower price than you were before, but you also have that output effect where you're selling more units. So by itself, this is a gain for the firm. And so what happens to your overall revenue just depends on which one of these effects is stronger. In the beginning, when you have more elastic demand up at the top of your demand curve, the output effect is always greater than the price effect. And so, for example, if you go from a price of 70 and a quantity of customers of 3,000 down to a price of 60 and a quantity of customers of 4,000, what you lose in price effect is smaller than what you gain in the quantity or output effect, right? But that's because up here demand is more elastic, and so your quantity of customers is going to change by more than the price does. Once you get down here, you'll start to see where that price loss is bigger than the customer gain because you have more inelastic demand. And so that's where marginal revenue or your revenue starts to fall as you continue to lower prices, because you lower the price and you don't make up for it by getting as many customers, new customers in the door with that lower price as you did before.